All right, welcome back to lecture number 72. This is historical topic 7.13, World War II, the military. And our theme is America in the world. We're going to be looking at the United States fighting in both Europe and Japan. Our learning objective is explain the causes and effects of the victory of the United States and its allies over the Axis powers. So to begin, Americans viewed the war as a fight for the survival of freedom and democracy against fascist and militarist ideologies. So that is to say that Americans were viewing the war in purely moral terms. They viewed the United States and their allies as good and their enemies as evil. This was aided through the use of propaganda. The Office of War Information controlled the news and promoted the goals of the war. They created the posters that you see on the screen right now. And they were trying to build support for the war. By framing it in these moral terms, people would be more willing to support having to give up certain freedoms and giving up their jobs to produce more war materials, giving up their loved ones to go and put themselves in danger and fight in the war. And the propaganda that was published, there was a racialized portrayal of the enemy, and that impacted Americans' treatment of Japanese Americans here at home. We talked about Executive Order 9066 in the last lecture, which created internment camps for Japanese Americans. Now, one thing that made this a little bit difficult in framing the war in moral terms was our alliance with the Soviets. So the Soviet Union was a communist state, and they were also an ally in the war against tyranny. So we were allying ourselves with a tyrannical power in order to fight another tyrannical power. And you can see in the poster down below on the left, you see a Russian soldier being portrayed as your friend because he fights for freedom. So the United States is trying to justify our alliance in order to continue to frame the war in this moral sense. All right, so the perspective that this was a fight for democracy was later reinforced by revelations about Japanese wartime atrocities, Nazi concentration camps, and the Holocaust. So for Japanese atrocities, we have the Bataan Death March. This happened in modern-day Philippines, and the United States held the Philippines as an overseas territory going back to the Spanish-American War. As the Japanese were expanding their Pacific Empire, they reached the Philippines, and eventually the U.S. military there under Douglas MacArthur has to leave and set up their operations from Australia, leaving about 60,000 American service members there. So those prisoners of war, along with some Filipino prisoners of war, are forced to march over 70 miles in a short time, and that produces about 15,000 casualties. The Japanese soldiers that were there sometimes randomly killed Americans and Filipino prisoners of war, tortured them, and when news came back to the United States, people were outraged. So you see pictures on the top right and an illustration of what it was like for Americans during this journey. So they're using these atrocities to try and build support against the Japanese. And then in Germany, there was the Holocaust, or across Europe, the Holocaust was going on. Germans, as they conquered new territory, would seek out the Jewish people and send them into concentration camps, Auschwitz being one of the most famous ones. So some were executed upon arrival in gas chambers, and others were worked to death. The images from the Holocaust are quite jarring. You can see just on the bottom right all of the eyeglasses of the people that were arriving in one concentration camp that were eventually killed. And in total, across the entirety of the war, there were about 6 million Jews who were killed. All right, military service provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their socioeconomic positions for the war's duration. That we talked about in the last lecture, number 71. So if you want to have more information on that part of this key concept, go back to that lecture. But what we're really looking at here is the debate over racial segregation, because in the military, the armed forces were still segregated. One of the lasting effects of this is that the Medal of Honor recommendations for African American soldiers go largely ignored through the entirety of the war, and it wasn't until 1993 that a commission recognized that there was systemic racism in the recognition of American soldiers. And so in 1997, the only 7 African American soldiers who received a Medal of Honor in their service to World War II were finally recognized. Unfortunately, 6 of the 7 had already died, and so only 1 was able to receive their medal. In 1948, Executive Order 9981, issued by President Truman, desegregates the armed forces. So this is a step in the right direction, especially for that double V campaign: victory abroad for against fascism and victory at home for equality. It was hard for America to justify their war in a moral sense of democracy against fascism when people at home were being denied some of the basic rights of living in a democracy. The notable division during World War II that was a segregated unit are the Tuskegee Airmen. So in Tuskegee, Alabama, they were educated at the Tuskegee Institute, the same one that was established by Booker T. Washington several decades before. There were about 992 pilots in total, and many of them were recognized positively with military awards. There was 1 Silver Star that came out of it, many other type of flying awards and Purple Hearts and recognitions that they received for their missions in bombing and escorting military supplies across the Atlantic. All right, so the United States and its allies achieved military victory through Allied cooperation, technological and scientific advances, the contributions of servicemen and women. So one of these technologies that's developed that helps the Americans fight the Germans is the development of radar. So it helps to detect the U-boats. And the radar essentially just puts the submarine on a screen, and that way the United States ships and the escorting pilots know where to find the submarine and bomb them or torpedo them so that they can have a clear path. This was instrumental in the Battle of the Atlantic. So in trying to control access through Atlantic shipping lanes to get the supplies that was necessary to Europe. There was also attempts at frequency hopping signals to jam radio-controlled torpedoes. This is actually developed by an Austrian-American actress, Hedy Lamarr. She was also an inventor. And while it was not put into use during the war, her concept of this frequency hopping signal is what will later be the basis for basic Wi-Fi and Bluetooth technology. The Manhattan Project is the probably most important technological effort during the war. It was led by scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, and he led the development for an atomic bomb. And the first successful test of an atomic bomb was on July 16th, 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico. His entire project was based out of Los Alamos, New Mexico, so out in the desert. It was highly secretive. No one knew what was going on. Even Vice President Truman, when he was elected with FDR, was not told about the project until he became president after FDR's death. Oppenheimer, upon seeing the first successful detonation of an atomic weapon, recalled a quote from the Indian epic, the Bhagavad Gita, in which the Hindu god Krishna reveals himself in all of his power, leaving his human form. And he says, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." Really setting up what is going to happen with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the type of destruction that these new types of weapons can create. All right, so the campaigns of island hopping and the D-Day invasion are going to be critical for an Allied victory. The island hopping campaign can be summarized the way in which Douglas MacArthur summarized it, saying, "Hit them where they ain't and let them die on the vine." So the United States was going to go across the Pacific and take over islands that were not heavily fortified or had been left by the Japanese, and cut off access for the Japanese Empire to Japanese Pacific Empire to not be able to resupply the islands that were in the furthest periphery or furthest part of the periphery in the Pacific. So as those islands that had been fortified are short on supplies, then they become weaker and the United States is able to take them over. They will continue doing this as they get closer and closer to the mainland of Japan, and as those battles continue, then they are starting to have to fight the Japanese in more fortified islands, like in the island of Iwo Jima and island of Okinawa, which are very close to the Japanese coastline. The Battle of Midway in June 4th to the 7th in 1942 really turned the tide of the war in the Pacific in the favor of the United States. It was a naval battle, but it was mostly fought with planes. So planes would leave aircraft carriers and do bombing campaigns on the opponent's ships and carriers, and it allowed the United States to have greater control of the Pacific and allow them to move forward into in closer to Japan. Douglas MacArthur, who had been forced to leave the Philippines earlier in the war, had vowed to return, and he does so, as you can see in the top right. He makes a show of it in leaving the hybrid transportation unit and steps onto the beach into the water, showing that he had returned. In Europe, D-Day opens up a Western front against Germany. So most of the fighting had been done first in Africa, where Germany had expanded into. Then they go into southern Italy, and then finally the Western front is opened up with the D-Day invasion. So there are landings in the Normandy region of northern France. There were 5 or so different beaches that were being attacked with an international force of Americans, British, and Canadian forces. Once they secure their position in northern France, it allows for more troops to land in northern France and then start making their way east into Germany. The last German counteroffensive is going to be the Battle of the Bulge. Once the Battle of the Bulge ends and the Allied powers beat back the German counteroffensive, it's all but over for the Germans. In April of 1945, the Soviets reach Berlin from the eastern side, and Hitler commits suicide. And then finally, on May 8th, 1945, victory is declared over Europe. All right, and so finally, the use of the atomic bombs hastened the end of the war and sparked debates about the morality of using atomic weapons. President Truman, like I said before, is made aware of the Manhattan Project shortly after ascending to the presidency. He's informed about the power of this new type of weapon. And because he foresaw a lot of American casualties in a mainland invasion of the Japanese islands, he thought that this would be a way for the Japanese to see the potential dangers of continuing to fight in World War II and bringing a closer end to the war, or a sooner end to the war. After he tells the Japanese that we have a new kind of weapon that is very destructive and so therefore they should surrender immediately, the Japanese ignore that threat, and so on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, the United States bombs the city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can see the type of devastation that was caused with the before and after pictures of both cities. About 250,000, mostly civilians, die instantly from the blast. And then millions more are going to be suffering from radiation poisoning and cancer. So the radiation poisoning would kill all of the living cells inside of people's organs, and they would die a very slow and painful death. And then many others would live more years into their lives and then develop cancerous tumors, which would make their life difficult and eventually kill them. And because of the second bombing, finally on August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito surrenders and victory over Japan is declared. Douglas MacArthur will sign the surrender with the Japanese aboard the USS Missouri, and MacArthur, having been a student of history or a student of U.S. naval history, takes the flag that flew over Commodore Matthew Perry's ship back from the 19th century. He was the Commodore who had opened up Japan to the rest of the world and threatened them to begin trade with the United States, and flies that flag that had come into aboard the ship of Perry's ship, and then he flies that over the USS Missouri as the Japanese are signing their surrender. The United States attempted to justify the killing of 250,000 civilians and saying that that would have been fewer people dead than if the war had continued. That in a total war such as World War II, civilians also make up a part of the war effort, and so therefore they are fair game. We also try to justify it in saying that the Japanese had committed atrocities and war crimes of their own, as we saw in the Bataan Death March. But across history, there have only been 2 nuclear weapons that have been used in times of war, and that has been the ones that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So hopefully that will continue to be the case, and none will ever be used in war again. All right, so here's our recap. Americans' view in the war was seen in moral terms. Segregation continued in the armed forces. There was new technology that was helpful in fighting the war. Also, it was more destructive. Island hopping in the Pacific and D-Day in Europe were critical to the Allied victory. And finally, the use of atomic weapons in war is controversial, and only 2 weapons have ever been used, and that's on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right, thank you for watching this lecture. Please be sure to come back for lecture number 73, in which we talk about World War II and post-war diplomacy. Thank you, and I'll see you then.